This is the best of our knowledge. I'm Bob Barrett. Many states have either passed or proposed bans on teaching critical race theory in schools. The bills seem to have less to do with education and more to do with political culture wars. But what exactly is critical race theory? Instead of asking a politician, I went to an educator. Rosalind Fisher is an instructor of sociology at the University of West Florida. I asked her for the origin story of critical race theory.
Critical race theory actually was used by academic scholars, started back in the 1980s, legal scholars, to address some inequities that existed in the law. And particularly, people were looking at issues like how the law was being applied in criminal cases, but also in equal opportunity cases. Brown versus the Board of Education was kind of one of the signature examples of critical race theory being applied, in which the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that separate is not equal and that state laws protecting segregated public schools are unconstitutional.
So in education, if you're teaching critical race theory, what are you teaching?
Well, there are basically 5 main principles of critical race theory. And the first is the recognition that race is not biologically real, it's a social construction. But it's a social construction that has real consequences for the people who are raced. So if there are stereotypes or perspectives about where your race is in a hierarchy, then that has profound implications for how you're treated in society. The second main principle is the acknowledgement that race is a normal feature of society and that it's embedded within many of our public policies and systems and institutions. So race is not just about one person having prejudice against another person. It is really the idea that racist incidents aren't just random aberrations, but they're actually manifestations of structural and systemic racism. The third principle is the rejection of popular misunderstandings about racism, like the fact that we confine racism to a few bad apples. Actually, racism is codified in law, it's embedded in structures and woven into public policy. And so CRT, critical race theory, rejects the idea of colored blindness, that while we might want to believe that we have objective systems in operation and that we can be colorblind, actually we all have our cultural baggage that we carry with us. And I'm very careful to tell my students that and to tell them that although I like to think of myself as being progressive and open-minded and all of those things, that I recognize that even the materials that I choose to teach them with are chosen with my biases, and that therefore it's important for them to do a little research on their own and for them to interrogate those materials along with me as we go through the course. One of the other principles is the recognition of the relevance of people's everyday lives to scholarship. A lot of what has been dismissed about racism and inequality in this society has been dismissed because it comes from the people who are experiencing the oppression or the inequality. And so people have said, oh, well, that's an anomaly, or, you're just emotional, or you're overreacting, rather than saying, okay, let's look for patterns here. Does this happen to one group of people and not to another? And now, of course, with George Floyd's death, we're beginning to do that, to look at some of these patterns. But they've existed all along. But because it was people of color who were saying they existed, those cries were ignored. And then the fifth issue, or the fifth principle, I should say, of CRT practice is the issue of social justice, that we cannot have change without actually discussing inequalities, issues of race, and social justice, that we have to be willing to actually act, that critical race theory isn't a noun, it's a verb. It requires action. So those are the 5 principles of critical race theory.
And there is a lot to unpack there. Uh, of course, right now it seems to be under attack very vocally. Many states, including the one we're sitting in right now, have outlawed its teaching. One of the main criticisms that is being said very loudly now, that if critical race theory says all white people are racist, isn't that racist too? That's not exactly what it says, right?
No. Critical race theory really focuses on policy, the policy arenas, and how we've created systems that have racism and inequality in them, and they've become invisible to us. We have the perspective that this is the way it's always been, and we don't interrogate those systems of inequality or those public policies, particularly if they don't negatively impact us or particular individuals. And so it's not really about blaming any particular group for racism. It's about looking at how we can make change in a society that has as its foundation racial inequality. We have to look at our history and say, we built our country on the basis of some particular things. Some of those values we said we had and the actual policies and the actual practices in place contradict each other. So we need to take a look at those contradictions and find those that still exist and actually change those. There's also something else that has to be recognized in that, which is that racial inequality and inequalities of all nature, gender, disability, all of those, they don't just impact the person that is, or the group that is raised, that is oppressed, or that is in some way disadvantaged. They actually have a negative impact on all of us. If people of color are being paid less to do the same work, or women are being paid less to do the same work, then those individuals are not able to contribute as much to the tax base. Those individuals are not able to spend as much money because they don't earn as much money. And so they're not able to contribute to the national GDP in the same ways. And so that affects us all. If those individuals are being paid so little that they can't afford health insurance, and they're having to use the emergency room to get medical care, then people like me, who would be considered, I guess lower middle class, we're going to pay more in our insurance to cover that. So those recognitions are being left out of that discussion that critical race theory is about saying white people are bad. That's totally inaccurate.
Is the term being correctly used in the debate? Are people using critical race theory now as the basis for all diversity and inclusion efforts, regardless of whether it's actually critical race theory?
Actually, diversity training is something totally separate from critical race theory. Diversity training, actually, some critical race theorists criticize because they say that it focuses on individual change and it focuses on organizational change in a very limited way, that it doesn't look at systemic inequalities and it does not look at the bigger picture of policy change, and that it actually avoids the elements of politics that are a factor in the existence of systemic racism. And so they're not the same thing. Black Lives Matter is not critical race theory, although critical race theory could be applied to the way that Black Lives Matter wants to bring about social justice. So, yeah, those are not the same things.
And I remember in the 90s, culturally relevant teaching became a thing. Is that, again, something different from critical race theory?
Culturally sensitive and racial teaching can be one aspect of critical race theory, but is not in and of itself critical race theory. One of the principles of CRT is the recognition that race is a social construct. So a teacher who's trying to do culturally sensitive teaching and trying to do some teaching that is informed by critical race theory would use that principle to say we need to recognize that this social construction doesn't mean that one group is less than another group. It doesn't mean that one group is more than another group. What it means is that we have some implicit biases that are a part of our history, and that those have been codified into law, into public policy, and into our processes, even the ways in which we teach. So another principle of CRT is the acknowledgement that racism is a normal feature of society, and that also could be part of culturally sensitive teaching. You have to recognize that when Black people leave their houses every day and white people leave their houses every day, they're not stepping out into the same world view and the same world experience. A friend of mine who's in a book club, I'm in a book club that's predominantly Black women. Well, it's all Black women. And she's in a book club that's all white women. And we decided we would try to get together once every couple of months, our two book clubs, to, make sure that we were keeping connected with each other and to be allies to each other. And she told a story about her sister driving on the highway and a person in the other lane trying to get in front of her. She let the person in front of her. She saw that a police car went by after this person got into the other lane in front of her. And as the car went further down the road, she moved over into the other lane. She looked over at the car that had gotten in front of her, and she saw a Black woman who was gripping the steering wheel of her car with such firmness and anxiety. She could also almost see the whiteness of this person's, hands and knuckles. And she said, and the anxiety on the woman's face, she said, was startling to her. And she said, as they went further down the road, when she looked over again, the lady looked more relaxed, and she eventually got off the interstate. And she said it occurred to her then that for a policeman to get behind her, that didn't create any real anxiety for her because she was going the speed limit and, so what? But for this Black woman, regardless of the fact that she was going the speed limit, there was an element of anxiety because she was a Black woman. And she said that for the first time penetrated for her. We're not living in the same world, I think the recognition that some teachers have is that is an important thing for students to know and to understand about the world if they're going to change the world. And it's particularly important to understand for kids of color because it can affect their safety in the world.
Still to come, our conversation with Rosalind Fisher continues with an answer to the charge that teaching critical race theory could be indoctrinating students. That's next on The Best of Our Knowledge. Got any questions or comments about The Best of Our Knowledge? Send them in. Our email address is knowledge@wamc.org. And if you'd like to listen to this or any past programs again, you can find them online at our flagship station's website. Just go to wamc.org and click on the programs link. And while you're there, subscribe to the Best of Our Knowledge's podcast or download the WAMC radio app to listen on demand anytime, any place. This is the best of our knowledge. I'm Bob Barrett, and our guest today is Rosalind Fisher, an instructor of sociology at the University of West Florida. We're talking about teaching critical race theory and trying to answer some of the questions that are being asked, some quite loudly in the national debate on the topic. One objection is that teaching critical race theory is indoctrinating students. So I asked Fisher if she was indeed indoctrinating students by teaching CRT.
I don't think I have that superpower, but I'm not sure I would want to have it because I like to hear opposing viewpoints from my students because I learn things and because I realize that I have, biases too, and that I have some areas of blindness because when I walk out the door, I know I'm a Black woman of a certain age and all of these things impact the way the world treats me. Well, they're walking out the door as something too, and that affects their worldview. And it's a worldview that I sometimes have no understanding of or recognition of. I think that education should, at its best, help people understand what different experiences are of the world. It should provide some facts, some history, some information for people to interrogate for themselves. Kids can do that. Adults can do that. I don't think critical race theory is for little kids. I think it's a little too much for them. But high school students could get it. And I think it might be important for them to be able to get it. Definitely college students should get it. And the little I've talked to my students about this, they said, wow, I wish I'd known this before. Why didn't anybody ever talk about this? So it's not my intention to indoctrinate so much as it is to inform.
Will you bring up something that has always kind of itched the back of my brain as I learn more about events in our history that I was never taught? Will this, if not just teaching flat out critical race theory, morph into a maybe more inclusive curriculum of U.S. history?
Yes, that is the hope, because most of the time when you hear about race or you hear about Black people, African Americans, you only hear about them when it comes to history. That's the only area that we tend to appear in. And then it's generally about slavery. So critical race theory, I think, broadens the base of information we have about all of the parts all of us play in things. For instance, critical race theory might help people to think about, why do we have such conflicting viewpoints about Civil War monuments? Why is it that some people have such strong negative feelings and other people have such strong positive feelings about Civil War monuments? Critical race theory has some answers for people about that. Why is it that historically people of color have had such a difficult time creating legacies for their kids? And how does this go back to things like the fact that in the GI Bill in 1944 was not applied equally to Black soldiers when they came home as it was for white soldiers? That the ability to build wealth was negatively impacted by that. Home ownership, land ownership, all of those things which helped many white soldiers returning home begin to build some family wealth and legacy, was not available to Black soldiers until much, much later. Some of these things would come out. There are all these composers who are missing from music. I'm talking about classical composers, Black and female and Asian, and all of these people that are missing from the story that critical race theory would help us to excavate. It would make a huge difference in the way we look at a lot of public policy, like the fact that insurance policies charge different amounts for people of various genders and races. Why is that? How is that justified? Lifespans. Why is it that the mortality for Black mothers is greater than for white mothers? What's happening there with maternal mortality? Why is it that Black men have the highest death rate of anybody else in this country, closer to people in less industrialized nations than people in any industrialized nation? What's going on there? I mean, all of these things, looking at these things from a critical race theory perspective, could make a huge difference in people's lifespan, in their education, in their experience of the world, in their treatment, and in our economic base. We are missing money from the table that we could recoup if we were treating people in an equal way.
There's a whole list of charges against critical race theory and teaching critical race theory that we could go through, one of which is that critical race theory just says that minorities have been discriminated against. So long, it's now time for whites to be discriminated against.
Yeah, I hear that, and I understand that there's always a backlash when it seems as though one group is beginning to rise. There is the perspective that this other group is going to be disadvantaged. The example I use is right now, there is a house on fire, and further down the block, there are other houses, and they're close enough to smell the smoke, but they're not on fire. So right now, we need to put some energy towards putting out that fire that's burning up the street. It's not our house that's burning, but that fire could spread to us. And just in terms of humanity, do we really want somebody else's house to burn down? Do we really want the possibility that someone else is being hurt by those flames? So let's put out the burning house, and let's recognize that that may prevent your house from ever catching fire. But if it doesn't, we're going to come and put out your fire next. This is a collaboration. We don't have to be competitive in our miseries. I understand that a lot of white men who are in lower paid jobs in particular say to themselves, they talk about me being privileged, but I don't feel so privileged. You know, I'm struggling to make ends meet. Maybe I'm even working 2 jobs to make ends meet. So what are they talking about? You know, what about me? That kind of inequality and oppression also exists, and it should not be ignored. But the reality is, whether you want to be privileged or whether you consider yourself privileged or not, whiteness does come with some privileges. No one is saying that your pain, your suffering, your inequality isn't important. All of these should be addressed, but we shouldn't be ignoring someone else's oppression because we're also oppressed or because we also have inequalities. What kind of logic is that?
And that, unfortunately, is all the time we have for this discussion. I have no doubt we'll be hearing more on this topic in the future. Rosalind Fisher is an instructor of sociology at the University of West Florida. Some states invest a lot educating students, but will those students stick around so states can get a return on that investment? That's the topic of today's Academic Minute.
Where do students go after graduation? I'm Dr. Lynn Pasquarella, president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And today on the Academic Minute, Michaela Maria Lamonic Arthur, professor of sociology, takes a look.
As competition for limited state funding grows fiercer, policymakers reasonably care to know whether the funds they invest in public higher education pay off. Research has shown that indeed this investment does pay off in a variety of ways, including increased tax revenue, reduced healthcare and criminal justice costs, and enhanced civic engagement, as well as by attracting businesses and thus economic development. But policymakers may wonder if the funds they invest will result in benefits to their communities, or if, in contrast, students will leave the area taking the benefits of the state's investment with them. While the pursuit of higher education is correlated with increased geographical mobility, most young college graduates remain in the state in which they completed college. However, students who attend college out of state are more likely to leave the state where they attended college than are those who attend college in the state in which they completed high school. Perhaps it makes more sense to think of these students as transient. They are not leaving the state in which they attended college, but rather never really lived there. However, many college graduates who do leave eventually return. And this pattern of return migration actually may provide the greatest benefit of all. My research with Fran Leazy's found that students were particularly likely to leave the state if they were seeking a graduate degree, and that many eventually returned, bringing their new knowledge and skills back to enrich their home state. And research has shown that a highly skilled workforce is key to attracting business investment. Thus, our research suggests that if states wish to retain high-skilled college graduates, their best bet is to invest in public college education for those already living in their state and to expand access to graduate degree programs locally.
That was Michaela Mariel Lamonic Arthur of Rhode Island College. You can find this, other segments, and more information about the professors at academicminute.org.
The Academic Minute is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in partnership with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. That's all the time we have for this week's program. If you'd like to listen again, join us online at our flagship station's website. Go to WAMC.org and click on the programs link. While you're there, subscribe to our podcast or any of the other WAMC or National Productions podcasts. And if you have any questions or comments about the program, send them in. Our email address is knowledge@WAMC.org. And you can find us on Twitter at TBOOKnowledge. I'm Bob Barrett. Be sure to join us next time for another edition of The Best of Our Knowledge.
Bob Barrett is producer of The Best of Our Knowledge. Dr. Alan Chartock is executive producer. The Best of Our Knowledge is a production of WAMC Radio's National Productions, which is solely responsible for its content. Hear more at WAMC.org.